In San Francisco, this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, cooking it up. Apple CEO Tim Cook takes the stage in Cupertino Tuesday. His deputies reveal the new iPhone 11 models with 3 colors and 3 cameras. Details on those devices and more, like the Apple Watch Series 5. Plus, subscription service. Apple's TV Plus finally gets a price. It will cost the consumer about $5 a month. How the price and content stack up against other streaming content companies. And the hits keep coming. Mutual fund giant Fidelity reduced its WeWork valuation by 34% in March, adding to the office rental company's pre-IPO woes. But first, to our top story. It was a big day for Apple as the tech giant launched its newest hardware at its annual product launch in Cupertino, California. Among the new items unveiled, a new Apple Watch and a low-cost iPad, not to mention a bunch of announcements tied to its new services, Apple TV Plus and Apple Arcade. But as always, all eyes were focused on the freshest versions of the iPhone.
This is the iPhone 11 Pro, and these are the most powerful and most advanced iPhones that we have ever built in a stunning new design.
Apple unveiled the iPhone 11, the iPhone 11 Pro, and the iPhone 11 Pro Max. The iPhone 11 is about $50 cheaper than the iPhone XR, coming in at around $700. The iPhone 11 Pro price will still hit that same $1,000 mark as the XS. And to discuss in Boston, I'm joined by Ryan Reith of IDC, and here in San Francisco, Bloomberg Technologies, Mark Gurman. Mark, let me start with you. You have been covering these for years and years. How did today feel relative to years past?
This was, another Apple event, but nothing really earth-shattering today, right? I mean, it's been a while since Apple has come out with an entirely new hardware product that changed the game. The most surprising thing today was really around pricing of TV Plus, Apple Arcade, the $50 price reduction on the iPhone 11, as you mentioned. But in terms of hardware functionality, nothing really to write home about.
Ryan, let me bring you in here. Talk to me about the iPhone, because as we know, it still makes up a decent amount of top line for the company. What was your biggest takeaway as it comes to the iPhone?
No, I think I agree with Mark. To be honest, not to sort of beat this drum, but I think that's the storyline today. It's all about pricing, right? So on the hardware side, we start with iPhone, as Mark sort of mentioned. You've mentioned the $50 price cut from where we were with the XR. I think Apple's, to be honest, in my opinion, them leading with services partnerships that came out between Arcade and News, and then obviously getting to lower cost iPhone pricing and even watch pricing, I think just shows that they see that we've pushed the threshold of the average consumer pretty high on price points, and that they've got to be cautious of that, right? Because their important thing right now is keeping the install base and making sure that it grows, which I think they're still doing a good job at that.
So Ryan, are they maxed out at a $1,000 iPhone?
So listen, I don't think we'd ever max things out, right? Because keep in mind, starting points are never actually what the highest point actually gets to, right? So we're probably talking upwards of $1,500, $1,600 with the highest configurations. But no, I think that they're going to continue to push things. But I think what they're realizing is that their audience who will actually pay that price to use those features is probably smaller than it was when their highest iPhone price was $800. So, it's sort of a changing of the times. It's not Apple only that's being affected by that. Their main competitors at the top of the market, Samsung and Huawei, are both being affected the same way. So it's sort of just a changing times, in my opinion. But I do think that we'll continue to see price points that will sit well over $1,000 with iPhones.
So, Mark, I want to come into my terminal here at GTV Go. What we're taking a looking at in white is the average sales price, which is starting to rise a little bit. But along with that, on the right-hand column, is the number of iPhones sold, which is slowly dipping down. What does that tell you about where we are in the cycle?
Yeah, it tells us that there really has been a combination here of rising prices and a decrease, and it's ironic given the invitation today, innovation, right? The changes here are really all about the camera. If you go to Apple's website about the iPhone, 11 Pro, 75% of it is about the new camera functionality. And that's what the past few years have been about. The last time we saw a real breakthrough change to the iPhone was with the iPhone 10 2 years ago. We're expecting bigger changes again next year as the prices are coming down, so I think things are going to start to rebound in about 12 months from now.
Ryan, what do you make of this device no longer being an iPhone, but really a camera that basically just has some audio capabilities?
Yeah, well, I guess it's probably been more than a phone for quite some time, right? But no, it's a good question, and to be honest, I think that the features that they've introduced, some of which have met some people say that like things like night mode have met up to what Google has done and others and so forth, and that's great. I think what's important to recognize is what the average consumer actually does with their camera, and I think, to be honest, with not just for Apple but some of these others, some of the features that they're integrating, a lot of that's done through software, not just modules and number of megapixels and so forth. I don't think personally everyone's actually utilizing that to the full benefit. Having said that, everybody wants the latest and the greatest, right? So I think it's important that they continue to innovate, and clearly they've been a market leader in photography, and they continue to be so.
Mm-hmm. Ryan, the lowest price point comes in at $700. Last year it was $750. Does that concern you as it relates to Apple or the industry?
No, it doesn't concern me. I think on either. I think, to be honest, like I said, I think if I'm Apple and I'm sitting there looking at the long-term strategy, there's many things going on, right? There's products that we don't know about. There's continuing the product lines they have. I think the main thing for them, though, is making sure that, one, they do not lose their install base, and two, more importantly, they grow it. And I think by recognizing that, hey, there's a large number of users that are frustrated with the price points of smartphones in general, how high they've gone. I think it's perfect for them to play right into the fact to say, hey, listen, we're going to continue to innovate. You can still get a brand new iPhone that's going to be top of the line quality, that's not going to be priced at the $1,000 price point or even above, and it's actually going to be a little bit less than that same sort of product line last year with the 10R. So I think the strategy is right. I think it's them recognizing that everybody has to test the waters in terms of like price ceilings for the average consumer, because nobody really knows where that stops. But if you look at the last 5 years, the average selling prices have grown so much in the last 5 years compared to the 10 years leading up to that it's a night and day comparison. Yeah. So it had to slow down at some point.
Mark, quickly here, these phones don't have 5G. We won't get 5G until a year from now. So why do I care?
Right. I mean, 5G in the United States is just rolling out now, not a big deal. The real impact, that's going to be in China.
Yeah, wonderful. IDC's Ryan Reith and Bloomberg Technology's Mark Gurman, thank you for joining me. And coming up, watching your health while Apple is betting on wearables that will help it transform the health industry. That's next. And if you like Bloomberg News, check us out on the radio. You can listen to us on the Bloomberg app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on Sirius XM. This is Bloomberg. Apple has debuted an always-on Retina display that never sleeps as part of its Series 5 watch unveiling Tuesday. Beyond the screen, Apple says it continues to pursue ways to boost health, as CEO Tim Cook pointed out.
We're really excited about the impact the Research app can have. It gives us, all of us, an amazing opportunity to participate in health research that could lead to innovations to improve our health and the health of future generations.
To discuss, let me bring in and go on over to Apple's headquarters in Cupertino, California, where Creative Strategies Principal Analyst Carolina Milanesi is standing by. Carolina, thank you so much for joining me. Talk to me, how much of a surprise was the Watch 5 today?
I think from a watch perspective, what was interesting was I think nobody has actually thought about the always-on screen. A lot of people had complained from the get-go that was a feature that consumers wanted, especially consumers that were trying to switch from a traditional watch to a smartwatch. But today was really about moving the envelope, if you like, on the health side, and really hearing Apple clearly that this is an area where they want to continue to develop, they want to stay for the long run, and creating a health research app speaks to that.
Is pricing at $399 competitive or expensive?
$399 is competitive, and even more competitive is the $199 price point of the first generation Apple Watch. We always get carried away and excited about the latest model, but when you look at the lineup, I think that's where it is becoming more and more obvious that Apple wants to get consumers that are part of their install base to venture into new devices. So you might be an iPhone user and have yet to find out what the value add of an Apple Watch might be. $199 price point is maybe an easier way to get you to try it than not $399.
Right, so the $199 for the 3 that they lowered today, you think that that's a good thing that the company's doing?
Absolutely. It is getting that entry level more interesting for consumers. We had a bit of an impasse on the Android side as far as Android Wear and new devices that coming to the Android ecosystem. Outside of Fitbit, which I'm sure today is going to look quite worried about that $199 price point. We haven't seen a lot of uptake on the watch form factors. A lot of bands out there, fitness bands, but not so many watches.
Right, you mentioned Fitbit, and I was looking at that earlier as well. How concerned should other wearables be today?
I think they should be quite concerned. I think Apple Watch has become the smartwatch that the rest of the industry is looking up to, and that $199 price point is super competitive with a device that doesn't feel that you're really compromising on your experience, and that's the core part. You're not getting a device that you feel doesn't give you the key features that you want, and so why not try and see what it can do for you.
Talk to me finally, Carolina, about integrating services and doing health research. What about the future of health and Apple excites you?
Yeah, I think to me that's the next level, and it's not just something that Apple wants to do for the goodness of the human race, so to speak, as far as making us all more healthy, but it's really a good way to get people to see value from the ecosystem at a level where it impacts their lives. It's not just about entertainment, it's not about having a gadget, but it's really having a device that can make a difference in your life. And they played a video during the keynote that spoke to that, having people that have had heart arrhythmia highlighted to them by the watch, and having been able to get to the hospital on time and prevent something that would have changed their life forever. That is very, very powerful.
Mm-hmm. That was Creative Strategies Principal Analyst Carolina Milanesi. Thank you for joining me. And from a hotly anticipated IPO to will it even happen? That's a concern swirling around WeWork's public debut. The office rental company's biggest backer, SoftBank, is pushing the company to postpone its offering amidst concerns about a drop in valuation. Remember, earlier this year, Goldman Sachs pinched WeWork as a $65 billion business, and now there's word that mutual fund Fidelity cut its stake in WeWork in March. To discuss, I want to bring in Bloomberg Tech's Ellen Hewitt. So, Ellen, the IPO is in flux. Is this because of WeWork or SoftBank?
I think it's a lot of different factors. We're seeing a lot of confusion, and a lot of our reporting is suggesting some divisiveness within the WeWork and SoftBank relationship about how to proceed in this hotly anticipated IPO. So like you mentioned, this is something that WeWork has been planning since they first filed confidential documents to go public late last year. But as things have progressed, it sounds like the valuation has started to drop below what the company had expected, and what its most recent private valuation was $47 billion.
How much of this is real concerns about WeWork versus the broader market volatility and the tough IPO market, frankly, that it's been this year?
It's probably both. There's, I think, some timing issues. Earlier this summer, when we were reporting on the potential timing for the WeWork IPO, there was discussion around wanting to get the IPO done while the market was still in a good place. At the same time, some of the revelations that came from the public IPO prospectus, which came out in August, have stirred up more discussion about conflicts of interest within WeWork, in particular related to their CEO, Adam Newman. So this is a company that has very complicated corporate structure, as well as a lot more related party transactions than your average company.
I want to come into my terminal here at GTV Go. I know within IPOs we talk about equity markets. I want to fold this over into a high-level analysis of the bond markets. We are now for the first time dipping below par. That is the first time, as you mentioned, really going back in a few months. We're now at under par, 98 cents on the dollar per se. Without analyzing bond fundamentals, what does this tell you about the level of nervousness in the market?
I think it indicates bondholders are having some concerns about what the future of this bond could look like. This is a bond that WeWork first started selling early last year. And as you mentioned, it's been above par since about August, which is when the S1 went public. And so I think there was optimism around that time that an IPO could come and that cash infusion could then help support the bond. And now I think as we're seeing that the IPO plan is maybe in flux, it seems like bondholders are reacting with a little bit of concern.
After SoftBank, other big investors, namely Fidelity, they cut their valuation of WeWork going back in March. What did they see that the market or Wall Street didn't see until now?
I'm not sure that we're going to know. When Fidelity reviews their internal valuations around some of their holdings, they don't usually make it clear why. I think we can have some guesses as to maybe they were anticipating an IPO and maybe trying to react to that news, knowing that the equity could soon be public. But it's a little hard to understand. I think WeWork has just been a company that's been under a lot of scrutiny, and as each development has come forth, we've seen some changes. You know, like every time they announce that it seems like they are going to go public, but then now it seems like maybe not. And I think we're just going to have to wait and see.
Well, and don't even get me started on how to discount those cash flows of future lease payments. Thank you. That was Bloomberg's Ellen Hewitt. And coming up, $5. That's how much customers will pay monthly to stream Apple TV Plus. That's compared to $13 Netflix is asking for and the $15 for CBS All Access. We break down the competition in the streaming space next. And Bloomberg Technology is live streaming on Twitter. Check us out at Technology and be sure to follow our global breaking news network at TikTok on Twitter. This is Bloomberg. As we continue to report, Apple launches a number of products at its event in Cupertino, but the tech giant still pushes to become a services company. This holds true when it comes to the Apple TV.
All of these incredible shows for the price of a single movie rental. This is crazy. We are so excited about Apple TV Plus that we wanted to do something really special. And so starting today, when you buy an iPhone, an iPad, a Mac, or an Apple TV, you'll get 1 year of Apple TV Plus included for free.
So does this new incentive show that Apple is really pushing into services or still relying on hardware? To discuss, I'm joined by Forrester research analyst Julie Ask. So Julie, services company or hardware company?
It's ever increasingly becoming a services company. I think the announcement around the Apple TV Plus is significant for several reasons. I think it's the first time we've seen Apple create its own content. Together, Apple TV plus Arcade fill two gaps in its subscription services. You know, it already has news, it has music. If you add all of that up, it's easy to foresee that Apple is getting $400 or $500 a year in services revenue from any given customer, and then it fundamentally changes their business model and how they sell, right? They go from being a device company that's trying to keep consumers excited and get a purchase from them every 2, 3, 4 years to a company that's collecting revenue on a monthly basis. So when you look at today that the services revenue is already 15 to 20% of their revenue, and you imagine that these additional services make that even stickier, this is a very different game that Apple is then playing, and it becomes very different for how you think about the company.
How competitive is $4.99 a month?
So I think when you look at the $4.99 a month, you have to take into context that Apple doesn't have the same kind of a library that maybe a Netflix or some of its competitors do. But what I believe it is a solid foundation, and it's a good starting point. And especially with giving it away with new hardware purchases, it gives its consumers a chance to try it and experience it before they make an even bigger play.
So, Julie, I want to come into my terminal here at GTV Go, and basically all you need to know is we're looking at a massive debt pile of Apple. Now, cash, I should say, massive cash pile, up to more than $200 billion. Is that cash that they've been storing to now start spending to keep up with Netflix?
So I think that's one of the areas they can spend the money. They could also spend the money supporting game development as part of Arcade. But I think absolutely, what today indicates is they will spend more money to support the content, create content, and push forward with the services business.
Julie, it was notable that the shares reacted not on the pricing of $4.99, but on the fact that when you buy a new device, you now get 1 year free for Apple TV. And then the shares of their competitors, like Disney, Roku, all started to fall. Netflix, all started to fall. Does that show Apple's still reliant so much on that hardware?
So I think if you just, if you look at their financials, yes, they are still reliant on the hardware. It is still 70–80% of their revenue. But I think what you're looking at is something that's more about the future of what Apple will be. And if you look at how quickly their services revenue is growing, and it's already at 15–20%, the more that they can get consumers into subscriptions, the stickier those services can be, and the faster that revenue will grow, and the turnover, the switching costs on that, and even of the devices will be higher. The other thing that you have to keep in mind is the more services and the more content they roll out, and the more the more consumers they get committed to subscriptions, and the more valuable the devices become. And then those two things play off of one another. And I think this also shows the strength that they're building with the vertical integration of hardware, the software, and the services, including content. Each purchase, whether it's a subscription or a device, makes everything else more valuable for the consumer.
Julie, what type of content would you like to see from Apple so that they are distinguishing themselves from their competitors?
It'd be hard to say at this point what's missing. If you look at the media tends to be the number one thing. Gaming, music, and video are the top three things in that category. So it's hard to point now and say, well, hey, there's a media category that's missing. But I will think it will be interesting to see further down the road, if Apple goes beyond payments and clouds and some of the things core to their business, and what things they might do that are more horizontal. Will we see Apple go into subscription services for things that are non-digital, for example? But not what they do today, not their core business, but it would be interesting to watch.
Wonderful. Julie Ask of Forrester Research, thank you for joining me. And coming up, we hear from Microsoft President Brad Smith and his thoughts on the current trade tensions between the U.S. and China. That's next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Technology. I'm Taylor Riggs in San Francisco. We are getting some headlines now on Peloton. It is setting its IPO offering of 40 million shares at $26 to $29 per share. We will continue to watch the pricing. Now, we continue to cover Apple's product launch, which includes a new Apple Watch, low-cost iPad, and of course, 3 new versions of the Apple iPhone. But one theme that did not come up, Apple's current relationship with China, or how the company's products have been impacted by tariffs. Now, remember, products like Apple Watch, AirPods, HomePods, and iMac computers have already been hit by this month's 15% tariffs. So is now the right time to be putting a spotlight on a new product? And will they be impacted by the ongoing U.S.-China trade war? To discuss, I bring in Wedbush Securities Managing Director Dan Ives, who currently has an outperform rating on the company, and also with me, June Zhang of Rosenblatt Securities, who does have a sell on the company. Dan, let me start with you. Can you quantify for me to date the impact of China tariffs on Apple's bottom line?
Yeah, we view it right now in terms of the stock, it's about $20 to $25 overhang in terms of on the stock. Now, in terms of EPS and trying to get into the fundamentals, thus far it's really been tepid. It comes down to that December 15th tariff. Once that kicks in, which we believe they absorb that piece, that'll be about 4% hit to EPS if that goes through. And ultimately, if that continues, they'll ultimately have to pass that to the U.S. consumer. And we think at that point, you could lose about 6 to 8 million iPhone units in the U.S., given higher price points.
June, let me come to you. What is your take on the impact so far on China tariffs?
I think the tariff on the AirPods, tablets, and iWatch has been affected in September 1st. So we do see in the supply chain perspective that Apple speed up the shipment of those products in August. So we believe that after the holiday season inventory build, the Apple shipments for those products will slow down in Q4. And also for the iPhone, we think that this time Apple launched 3 models at the same time in September compared with last year. They launched iPhone XR in October. So we believe that's also changed a little bit seasonality for Apple shipment this year. So Q3 a little bit above normal seasonal, and Q4 going to be below seasonal. So that's why we have concern that even before the tariff happened in December, Apple iPhone shipment will slow down in October and November timeframe.
Dan, you said that eventually Apple could pass these costs down onto the consumer at a, let's say on average, $1,000 per phone. How much more can they pass on to the consumer?
That's the question. I mean, we do believe it's about $100 to $110 in terms of what the average iPhone would go up if the tariffs come in. And that's why right now they continue to be the poster child for the U.S.-China UFC trade battle, which is why also today was so important in terms of putting growth in the tank in terms of iPhone 11, looking at the services piece, as this continues to be a black cloud in terms of the tariffs over Cupertino.
June, were you surprised today that there was no mention of the China tariffs? I thought maybe Tim Cook would touch on it a little bit or try to brush it off. Any surprise that it was a non-event?
I think looking at their iPhone 11, the retail price is $50 lower than the iPhone XR. I think that's probably gave a little bit room for the tariff happen in December. Also, I think right now, I think they're trying to speed up the shipment to the U.S. market. So probably before the tariff happened in December, they can build enough inventory for the holiday season and also for the little bit of Q1 season for the Q1 sales.
So June, when you talk about that price at about $7 versus last year $7.50, is that getting ahead of tariffs, or is that maintaining or defending market share?
I think if you look at iPhone XR last year, the retail price was about $750 US. But quickly in the first half this year, Apple dropped the price, I think 35% lower. So actually, the iPhone XR price is more attractive compared with iPhone 11. And I think even you put a 15% tariff in December, I think people would still go for iPhone XR instead of iPhone 11. So I think
Dan,
XR, yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. Dan, let me come to you quickly. What do you take of iPhone market share? And are we seeing more Huawei purchases in China as they start to get defensive and become perhaps maybe a little bit more nationalistic as well?
Yeah, look, I think the bark's been worse than the bite there, but no doubt, you look at the price cut, this is focused on China. 60 to 70 million iPhones in China are coming up for an upgrade, and especially given what you're seeing in China, that's the price cut was really Apple doubling down, going after China. You look at XR, fundamentally that was a swing and miss. And that's why ultimately China is key to Apple moving higher, not just from a supply perspective. Demand's going to be key. That's why today I view it as a step in the right direction. And I think investors, that continue to view this with a glass half empty, they're going to continue to prove the doubters wrong. And Cupertino came out swinging today.
Even though they don't have 5G and Huawei and Samsung do?
Well, 5G, that's 2020, and I think it comes down to the install base. You got 1.4 billion iOS devices. This is an install-based story, and that's why many that have missed this story over the last, call it 6 to 9 months, you go back 6 to 7 months ago, the New York City cab driver was negative on Apple. But yet the stock continues to move up, and I think it just shows it's an install-based story. That's the golden jewel. That's the core of our bull thesis.
Wonderful roundtable. Thank you both. That was Wedbush Securities' Dan Ives and Rosenblatt Securities' Jun Zhang. Thank you for joining me. And Microsoft President Brad Smith says the way the U.S. government is treating Huawei is un-American. As far as he knows, China's leading maker of networking equipment and mobile phones should be allowed to buy U.S. technology, including software from his company. Smith sat down with Bloomberg's Tom Giles for an exclusive TV interview about China and his new book, Tools and Weapons, The Promise and the Peril of the Digital Age.
The U.S. is the digital technology leader in the world today, but I think one of the important things for all of us to remember is that we don't actually invent or create technology by ourselves. If you buy an American technology product, a product that is made by an American company, in all probability, it consists of inventions that came from Silicon Valley as well as Bangalore and Beijing and Dublin and London, Toronto and Melbourne and the like. We need to continue that. If we were to try to construct a new digital iron curtain down the middle of the Pacific, in all probability, we would hold ourselves back rather than hold someone else back. We need to keep that in mind.
But there are some concerns that are probably valid concerns about the transfer of intellectual property across borders, concerns that the U.S. has raised about national security. What happens when there's theft of intellectual property on the part of the other party? Your book is not just about outlining the problems, but you've suggested some solutions. One in particular has to do with allowing for the transfer of goods and IP, but with limits. Can you talk a little bit about what that might look like and how in practice we can ensure safety, national security, but at the same time allow for this kind of much freer trade?
I think that that phenomenon is in part what makes this so complex. Of course, there are important national security and intellectual property implications that need to be thought through, that need to be addressed. We will, in all probability, have a new generation of technology export control rules in the United States. That's sensible. But they're going to need to work differently from the way they've worked in the past. In sensitive areas, technology that could have more important military uses, for example. You're still dealing with technology that may have important civilian uses as well, so-called dual uses. We'll need a regulatory regime that focuses on how the technology is being used, who the users are. Only by doing that can we protect national security while promoting economic competitiveness. And similarly with intellectual property, we need controls to protect IP, but we have to strike the right balance. In short, the nuances really matter.
Do we have the global infrastructure in place? A lot of people are talking about how the trade system internationally is broken. Do we have the institutions like the WTO that could implement these kinds of changes and reforms that you're referring to?
I think one of the things we talk about in our book is the need for a new generation of multilateral and really multi-stakeholder initiatives. We need to learn from the past. That's one of the points that we've made. It's one of the reasons that we draw on historical stories. The 20th century moved forward because of institutions in part like the WTO. Clearly, there are new strains, there are new pressures, there's much more dissatisfaction with the global trading system today. But even as we do recognize the shortcomings, we need to build, and build by bringing governments and companies together. We probably will need some new institutions to help us through this. But we're going to serve ourselves best by focusing on what's broken and not breaking what's fixed. And that's part of the balance we think the world needs to strike.
Part of your discussion focuses on the different ways U.S. consumers and Chinese consumers use technology, and you have some interesting and colorful examples. Can you talk a little bit more about how technology is used differently in the two countries and why that matters to our relationship with China?
It really does matter, and I think you make an excellent point. It goes to the multifaceted nature of the U.S.-Chinese technology relationship. On the one hand, there are frustrations that American companies have about a lack of market access, and I think those are legitimate frustrations as we describe. But at the same time, we shouldn't overlook the fact that there are times when Chinese consumers simply have different preferences. This is true of many populations around the world. A market tends to favor companies that address the different interests that consumers have. We've seen this at Microsoft, as we share in the book. There's a wonderful innovation that we created in China called Xiaoice. It's a chatbot. It's widely used by hundreds of millions of people in China. Bringing it to the United States led to some surprising challenges. And the same is true vice versa. I think you can look at the challenges that a company like Amazon or a company like Google has had in China, and part of it, at least, relates to formidable local competitors that moved in some ways in a different direction to meet the tastes of Chinese users.
That was Microsoft President Brad Smith. Coming up, here to serve you for just under $5. That's what Apple's hoping people will pay for its TV and arcade offerings. We discuss whether customers will be signing up. Next, this is Bloomberg. One thing is more evident than ever. Apple wants you to spend its dollars on its services, and whether it's $4.99 for the ability to play more than 100 exclusive games on iPhone, iPad, and Apple TV, or the same price to watch new Apple originals like The Morning Show, it is clear that the future for Apple leans heavily on its bevy of new services. And to get the lowdown on what this means for the iPhone maker, I want to go back to Apple's headquarters, where awesome founder Horace Daydew is standing by. So talk to me, Horace, what about services and Apple excites you the most?
Well, what we saw today was finally the pricing on these new services that are Apple's own creations, right? We have exclusive games and exclusive video or film content. Now, what we didn't know was the price. We also didn't know how they would distribute and promote this, and we just heard about the idea of having it be, at least for movies and film, for having it free for 1 year for anyone buying an Apple device. That number of buyers today would be in the hundreds of millions, and the installed base of Apple's customers are about 1 billion. So we're going to see a very quick trial going on and sort of how quickly people will take up these services as opposed to waiting for them to discover them on their own, as was the case for news and music for the last few years.
Horace, I want to come into my terminal here at GTV Go and show our audience basically revenue services and services revenue growth, which is good, but it has been slowing slightly on a quarter-over-quarter, year-over-year basis. Is service revenue growth growing enough?
Well, there has been a slight slowdown. Some of that was due to China, and comps with China were difficult based on regulations that had been changing. I think we'll see, and we've heard already that we're seeing a boost in the growth coming into the third quarter. I think overall, though, these new services are going to provide that sort of quantum leap in the type of revenue that we're going to be seeing. A lot of the revenue to date has been in apps and subscriptions, but obviously now we have Apple's own content, and it's going to be an interesting observation there as far far as how many people will take this. Again, we're looking at a base of 1 billion users, and this was just Oprah herself saying it. 1 billion pockets is where they're going after.
But Horace, you mentioned this before, and it was interesting. The stock not moved on the $4.99 pricing, but the fact that it came within, it was free if you bought a device. Doesn't that show that Apple is still heavily a hardware company, not a software services company?
Well, certainly it is, and I think it's a hardware company, but services are a way to attach more value to that hardware. Microsoft, I just want to quickly reflect on Microsoft because it had a crisis of slowing PC sales for over 9 years now, and yet the company's happily converted users to a subscription model, and investors reacted very positively. I think that's what's likely to happen with Apple, and we're going to be counting users and counting the attach rate going forward. Again, you can't do this without a strong hardware base, and I think the hardware base benefits from having great content as well.
Wonderful. Awesome co-founder Horace Dedu, thank you for joining me. Still ahead, a final recap of today's Apple product launch, all the hardware and services announcements you need to know about next. This is Bloomberg. As we've been talking about all hour, Apple has launched its newest hardware at its annual product launch in Cupertino, California. A new Apple Watch, a low-cost iPad, 3 new iPhones, not to mention a bunch of announcements tied to its new services, Apple TV Plus and Apple Arcade. Finally, to bring it all together, I am joined now by Ben Wood of CCS Insight. Ben, what's your big takeaway from today?
Well, I think we've seen a new chapter in Apple's journey. The iPhone was still a big part of the show, but we've seen them bring services to the business. Obviously, the announcement around what they're doing with their TV product at $4.99 a month. And for me, another standout product was the Apple Watch dropping to $199. That's going to be a big product in the holiday season.
So, Ben, the big thing, as you noted, was the iPhone. Huawei and Samsung have 5G phones. Apple still does not. Why do I care about today's announcement?
Well, I think it's kind of interesting. There's a huge amount of kind of hype around 5G right now. I've traveled all over the world. I've used it in Australia, Switzerland, UK, various other places. But we're right at the beginning of the 5G journey. And for Apple, I think they have recognized that they don't need to jump on that technology right now. And if you think about the profile of customer who's going to be buying an iPhone on this series of products, they're probably people who've got a 3-4-year-old iPhone, and a new camera and better battery life is probably enough for them. But one thing's for sure, next year is going to be a big year, and delivering 5G on that next iPhone is going to be absolutely essential for Apple's competitiveness.
Ben, you are the second person in just the hour on the program to talk about the benefits and what a smart move it was that Apple lowered the Watch 3 to $199. How nervous are competitors?
Oh, I should think they are pretty alarmed by that price move. I think having an Apple Watch starting with a 1 is a big deal, and I think that moving into the holiday season, that's going to be huge news. I think certainly Fitbit, for example, will be looking at that, given that they were competing in that kind of tier below the Apple Watch, and it's a formidable competitive situation. Furthermore, this is an unbelievable freight train of a product for Apple now, a multi-billion-dollar product category. Who would have thought that just a few years ago?
You are right, because it sort of was released with sort of a lack of fanfare and finally has taken off. Another thing that really took off today was the Apple TV. What do you make of $4.99 a month?
Well, I was really surprised. I did a straw poll of a few people before the event started, and for most people, they were thinking about the $9.99 or maybe a little bit more. I think it shows a real statement of intent from Apple in terms of the fact that they clearly want to get people hooked onto their content. They want to use that hook at that aggressive price point to establish their position there. Add into that with a new device, you get 12 months of Apple TV Plus, so that's $60 in the box, and you get the 1-month trial on other devices. I think it's going to be interesting to see whether Apple can land it in such a competitive space.
Ben, I want to come into my terminal here at GTV Go for our viewers, and what we're looking at basically is the cash hoard of Apple, which is now topping $200 billion. Where's the next acquisition?
Well, do you know what? I constantly think they're going to make a strategic acquisition here or there, but it just doesn't happen. They seem to be more than content in reinvesting in the business, making tactical little acquisitions of small companies that people don't expect. So right now, I don't have an answer to that question. But the one thing's for sure, if they wanted to buy something, they can go get it.
Ben, what is the biggest concern when it comes to tariffs?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
What is the biggest concern when it comes to tariffs and the fight between the U.S. and China as regards to trade?
Oh, absolutely. Sorry. So yeah, on the tariff side, I mean, the geopolitical situation is a major factor for all consumer electronics manufacturers right now. It can't be ignored, and different people are taking different levels of pain. I think for Apple, they're doing everything they can to make sure that it doesn't distract them from their core business. But you can have little doubt that there's a lot of lobbying going on to try and mitigate the risks that can come from that. But quite frankly, your guess is as good as mine. There are negotiations going on. There are bigger, wider macro issues which Apple needs to look out for. But they are in a lucky situation where they do have products that people love.
Well, we will stay tuned. That was Ben Wood of CCS Insight. Thank you for joining me. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. And Bloomberg Technology is live streaming on Twitter. Check us out at Technology. Be sure to follow our global breaking news network at TikTok on Twitter. This is Bloomberg.